War is and has always been one of the most controversial and hotly contested subjects. Today, Robert Greene is here, author of the 33 Strategies of War. It's an insightful look at some of the major battles and leaders in history, how they apply to our world today, and what we can learn from them on and off the field. Pleasure to have you here today, Robert.
Thank you for having me, Gregory.
Well, as I say, you really cover all of the major battles from ancient times, from ancient China to ancient Greece to the present day. But it's hard to read this book without thinking of Iraq.
Right.
Although you don't directly take on Iraq head on, but yet, being the strategist that you are, I'm sure that you have some thoughts on the subject. How are we doing in Iraq? How's it going?
Well, it's obviously going very badly. Everybody knows that. It's no great mystery. I'm not saying anything you can't see in the newspaper, but you know, it's interesting because I was writing the book as the war was developing. And from the very beginning, I would be telling my girlfriend, and she can attest to this, that I would be saying, I can't see how this will end. I just can't see how you could logically remove yourself eventually from Iraq and that it would be stable in any form. There's no end game here. And one of the most important chapters in the book is about knowing how to end things well, the exit strategy.
That's what I thought of you.
Which is very important for life, for business, and obviously for war. And I think people got into this war, you don't hear about this very often, but I think they got pulled into it for emotional reasons. Post 9/11, there was a little bit of anger, there was a little bit of sense of retribution. There was also this sort of rosy scenario that a lot of the neoconservatives were building up about this building a bastion of democracy in the Middle East. And people didn't think through this whole thing in a very rational way about what is the end game. And to me, it's a basic violation of one of the most solid military principles. So I can't see how it could, once you enter something without a proper exit strategy, it's almost, the more you try to get out of it, the worse it gets.
Well, and that's why I wanted to ask you your opinion, because, you know, obviously this is a very political subject. There are a lot of feelings on both sides. And I didn't know what you were going to say, by the way, because I didn't ask you in advance. But yet, I like the fact, though, that I think that one problem I have with a lot of this discussions in the general public on both sides is that I have a feeling that people don't really put it in the context of history. And so I wanted to get your opinion because I know obviously that's what you've been doing is studying other military battles and things throughout history. So I thought it'd be interesting to get your perspective since you have studied all of the other major...
Well, I think what I'm trying to do is I'm removing it from the realm of this heated political discussion. I'm not saying Bush is this evil person or anything like that. I'm looking at it strictly from a strategic point of view. How would a great general in the past, how would Napoleon look at this campaign? How would Grant or Sherman or Patton look at this? And I think clearly that this was a failure in the planning stage. And
what would Napoleon do?
Napoleon would have never gotten into such a thing like this, you know. Although
he did have his Russia.
He did have his Russia, yes. Napoleon had 10 great years of the greatest, most brilliant years of warfare, and then 10 years of decline and disaster. The main thing is, I compare this to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1970s. That's, to me, the closest parallel. And when you signal to the countries in that region, a very volatile region, that you're trying to plant democracy there and that you're basically wanting to get rid of the regimes in Iran, Syria, perhaps Saudi Arabia, it's in their long-term interest that you fail. So that's why I'm saying I don't see how this could end. When you pull the troops out in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, you're surrounded by all of these countries that don't want Iraq to work. Just like when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, nobody wanted the Soviet Union to succeed there.
So you don't think there will be some sort of popular uprising or support that would, for democracy, that you think that the governments will be able to resist the trend?
Well, first of all, you cannot, this is where I say strategy is a really important subject. And you have to, these are certain principles that are really important, that once you understand, it kind of guides your actions through things. So the notion that you can kind of plant democracy in soil that has never, where there's no tradition of democracy, where you have a country that's basically an artificial creation in the 1920s that was basically created by England and you know, various other powers. There's no way that this is going to take root in 2 or 3 or 4 years. It's almost like these people have attention deficit disorder. They're so impatient. They're tied into the 4-year election cycle, and they think that they can create democracy in just a couple of years when something like that can take 20, 30, 40 years.
Right, so you definitely think it'll take a generation or two, which is what I thought.
No, I think this is going to be a disaster. I was telling my girlfriend from the beginning, this could be one of the great military disasters of our time.
So you think it is another Vietnam?
It could be worse than Vietnam. And I don't mean to be alarmist. It could not be. But the potential is that you're going to drag in all of these other countries into the conflict. That's what I was saying before, when you're signaling to Iran, Syria, Saudi Arabia, that you have bigger interests. This is a grand strategic plan to bring democracy to the Middle East. You are going to be dragging all of these countries into a regional war where you have something like oil, which is so vital resource. Nothing like Vietnam had these kinds of consequences. This could be a great disaster.
Well, you bring up a few good points. And one thing I wanted to, you mentioned the comparison to Afghanistan.
Yes.
Obviously, that did not go so well for the Soviets, and you go into some of the details in the book about what happened with their strategy.
Yes.
But yet, the U.S. has had a better experience in Afghanistan. What do you think of how we're doing in Afghanistan, and how does that compare to Iraq? Why is it going comparatively well in Afghanistan, but yet not so well in Iraq?
Well, you hear reports that things aren't necessarily going so well in Afghanistan, that there is a tremblings of a civil war, of resistance going on there, where Afghanistan actually could turn into more of a Vietnam. It's hard to say. I'm not quite sure. But the thing was, the whole point of it was to knock out the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And for that purpose, going to Afghanistan made sense and was logical. But then we took our eye off the ball and we went into Iraq. And the whole question is, how do you deal with terrorism? Which is, I have a chapter in the book, strategy number 33, about what is the most rational way of dealing with terrorism. And if the point of going into Afghanistan, or the point of the post 9/11 strategy, was to end the war on terror, end terrorism, I make the point in the book that the military way of doing this is often the worst choice. That really, the smart thing to do is to figure out where does the money come for these terrorists, how do they communicate to each other, and to be very rational and strategic and knock out what is sort of their base, what we call in warfare their center of gravity. So I don't even know, okay, Afghanistan was necessary, but I think the whole foundation of the strategy that our country is applying in the war on terror is actually very misguided.
Well, and that is something I wanted to ask you about, because there's almost a sense that, well, first of all, in a more general level, has war changed permanently? I mean, it doesn't seem as though you have a straight-on battle anymore, that, it's all these people putting roadside bombs out. And I mean, do you think, is there some sort of change in the nature of warfare, or is it just in this particular situation? And
well, there are two schools of thought in warfare and in military strategy. One is that essentially nothing has changed since the beginning of time, since wars have been fought for how many thousands of years. And the other is that technology and weaponry has completely altered the nature of war. I'm of the first camp, that essentially warfare hasn't changed.
And because you do mention that there were terrorist incidents all the way back from ancient times.
There were. The Jews in ancient Rome were practicing terrorism against the Romans, and then I talk in there about the 12th century sect in Islam called the Assassins.
Which gave us the word in English.
Which gave us the word assassins, and were probably the first first terrorist campaign. It's been around. The nature of having weapons such as bombs and putting airplanes into buildings has sort of altered the game. And the point I make in the book is that what terrorists are after, and they've been after since it's begun, is to create as much chaos and disorder as possible. It's usually a group of people who are very small in number and who are very desperate. And this is their last means, their last resort. They can't even wage a guerrilla-style campaign. And so they want to create maximum chaos. They try at one little kick of a rock, and they try to start an avalanche. And so your response to terrorists has to be very measured. They want to suck you into a kind of a dynamic where you overreact. And in the overreaction, they have the power. They control the dynamic.
Because it's very psychological.
Yes. Well, all war is very psychological in its basis. And that's the point I make. All strategies are based on kind of working on the psychology of your opponent and putting them on the defensive or whatever. But terrorism is the ultimate psychological warfare.
Yes.
And the only people who've succeeded in history, and there have been those who've succeeded, are those who take a very measured, calculated, rational response and don't get sucked into the dynamic of fighting back with the military or into over-dramatizing it.
We'll be right back with Robert Greene, author of The 33 Strategies of War, right after this. We are back with Robert Greene, author of The 33 Strategies of War. Well, we were talking about terrorism, and again, obviously how psychological guerrilla warfare, terrorism is fought. Again, going back to the story with the assassins,
right.
It was very interesting because they basically had these people completely freaked out. That, I think you said a group of less than 50 people basically had the entire civilization at that time in fear because they never knew who was going to strike when. And that's obviously a big element of it, is you never know what's going to happen when and where, and you're looking all around, and are they behind me, and are they here?
Well, the thing is, we don't really obviously know how Osama bin Laden is thinking, what Al-Qaeda is thinking, and so there were people who were wondering, well, there should be another attack coming in the United States. When is it coming? But terrorists thrive off of that uncertainty. So even if Osama bin Laden can't physically launch another attack against the United States right now, we'll never know. But the fact that it could come at any moment gives them this incredible power. And the assassins, what they would do is they would infiltrate one of their members of this sect. This was the Ismaili sect in the 12th century. Into the closest, into the bodyguards of the vizier himself. And
sort of like infiltrating the Secret Service.
Yes. And they would either kill the person, or in one instance I tell a story of they had just simply left one of their knives in the ground, planted right next to his bed.
Saying we could get you if we wanted
anytime we get you, anytime we want to, we can kill you.
Like the horse in the bed in the Godfather?
It's pretty much like that. Yes, it is. And it's a potent weapon. The man now realized that anybody around him could be part of this sect, and it completely destroyed him mentally, and he decided, I'm not going to fight these people. I have to, find some way of compromising with them.
And he did reach a settlement with them.
So I make the point in the book, which is a very important point. I don't know how many people are saying this, but terrorism is in fact a very powerful and effective strategy. Some people think it's not working, that Osama bin Laden hasn't accomplished anything, but no.
Well, certainly you don't see, for instance, the territory gains or something that you associate with a regular war. But you would say that the psychological wins are real.
You have to understand how the enemy is thinking. They're not thinking in terms of gaining land or winning elections or taking this country or over, although of course eventually he would like that. They're thinking of trying to create as much chaos and disorder as possible. And in that sense, the 9/11 attack has been incredibly effective.
Now, what would you say to Bush's argument from a strategic point of view that if you keep them busy over there, they won't be over here, and that's the reason we haven't had an attack? Is that a good strategy, or?
No, it's basically nonsense. I mean, and history shows that. Essentially, you're trying to say that you're going to create this magnet for all of these terrorists that are going to come over to Iraq.
First of all, a rock apparently. They found a rock.
They found a rock. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, obviously. So now they're all over there, and you can say, well, there were terrorists already there. Or they weren't already there necessarily. No, it's not a smart strategy in and of itself. You could say that for other kinds of warfare, but for the war on terror, where the idea that you're going to smoke these people out is absolutely ludicrous. I don't see any validity in that, no.
So you would argue that, again, that the government, well, you said take a more rational, long-term, less knee-jerk approach, I suppose.
Well, a less political approach. The problem with the United States in dealing with something like this is if you tended to take the longer-term approach, the one that would actually work, where you say terrorists cannot survive unless they have money, right, obviously. And these people have a lot of money to fund their mayhem. If you take the idea that I am going to find out what their sources of money are, where they're getting it from, and I'm going to dry it up, I'm going to make sure that that connection to Saudi Arabia can't happen, wherever the money is coming from. Then it's like you knock out the chair, the legs of the chair from under them, and they cannot operate. They also can't, if you also make it impossible for them to communicate. This kind of longer-term approach doesn't work so well politically. For the newspaper, it maybe make you seem like for a few years that you're weak, that you're not demonstrating your resolve against terrorism. But it's actually the much more rational, logical approach. And I make examples in the book of times that it has worked. That's how Charles de Gaulle defeated the terrorist campaign against him from the Algerians in the early 60s.
Well, and indeed, you know, there's the common or the famous phrase that war is an extension of politics by another means.
Yes,
but when I was reading this, I thought, well, in a way, politics is an extension of war by another means when you come down to it. Because when you read about all the intrigues that were happening in the courts and things, a lot of times the battles were determined off the field, in effect. I think of when you talk about maybe Queen Elizabeth undermining the Spanish, and just again, or even Napoleon went with his marriage, which and the Austrian. So there was that whole dynamic off the field. That
Well, you mentioned Queen Elizabeth I, which is very appropriate. She was a brilliant strategist, very not underestimated. And basically, she was facing a very powerful, the Spanish Empire, which is the most powerful empire of the time. And England was actually quite weak, had a very small army. And she essentially defeated the Spanish Armada, one of the most brilliant military achievements ever, in an extremely smart fashion. She said, well, what is the foundation of Spain's power? The foundation of Spain's power is all of this gold coming from the New World. And I'm going to knock out that foundation. She basically set loose people like Sir Francis Drake to be pirates on the open sea, to take the Spanish galleons coming back with gold, and just taking a few of them completely ruined of Spain's finances because they were borrowing money based on how much gold was coming. She made the Armada so expensive for the Spanish that even if they won, it would have meant nothing. That's the kind of brilliant, long-term, rational strategy where you're thinking of winning and not thinking of making political points that I think would be much more appropriate for this kind of war.
So do you think in effect that really what's happening is that, well, you talk a lot about the dangers of leaders who, let's say, get caught in a certain mode of war or can't adjust to changing times, and is it just that the U.S. is used to fighting direct warfare and isn't thinking of the strategy that would be most effective in this type of terrorist campaign?
Well, there's a whole strand in American military strategy that goes, I make the point there's two ways of fighting a war. There's attrition warfare and maneuver warfare. This isn't me, this has been other theorists have come up. Attrition war is you beat your opponent down with your superior weaponry until there are hardly enough of them left and they put up the white flag and we surrender. Maneuver war is a much more Asian way of thinking, although Napoleon himself was a maneuver warrior. And you don't think of beating your opponent down. You think of maneuvering your army into a position which kind of takes the enemy by surprise, puts them on the defensive, ruins their whole balance, and in the process they crumble psychologically and they give in. We don't have a great tradition of maneuver war, but I'll tell you, the Desert Storm in the early 90s was one of the rare examples of the United States applying something more like a Napoleon or more like an Asian style of fighting. So we're very much into the camp of bombing the enemy into submission. It goes back to Vietnam, it goes back even further than that. And I think
we've got the bigger bombs, and my gun's bigger than yours or something, and that's
right. But look at what happened in Vietnam, an unbelievable example. Here we have the most powerful superpower in the world with all its technology and its bombs, facing an enemy that essentially has the technology of the 19th century. You know, they're carrying supplies on the backs of people, right?
And use that to their
and they won.
And that's what fascinated me about the book. I think was that, I would assume that most of the great military victories were just all-out attacks and the strategy. But again, some of the most interesting battles or campaigns or wars were won by, again, a lot of these just different techniques that were not directly fought on the battlefield, which...
And that's why I sort of make the analogy to life, because this isn't just a book about war. This is also a way of how you sort of think about your approach to any kind of problem in life. That through strategy you can avoid these kind of bloody battles that you might be facing even in your daily wars with people.
You mentioned like in the social realm or the business world, and I noticed there are a lot of references to Hollywood. Which why am I not surprised that you would compare Hollywood to a war? It's
well, I've worked in the film business, and I know that to me the job of a director of a film is like the commander, the general of an army, and it can be very chaotic and it can be very difficult. And if you don't have a director who's like firm, or a woman or whatever it is, who knows exactly what he or she is doing, the film will suffer. And the person I talk about is Alfred Hitchcock, who was the great strategist in creating a film.
And apparently, yeah, it was brilliant the way he would be half asleep, but yet on the set, but yet still managed to get exactly. To thwart the producers, I love the fact that he'd have an empty camera, or a broken camera, a camera with no film sitting there, and shoot the shots they wanted, just no film on the camera.
Right.
So maybe we need him to lead our army. I don't know. Yeah. We'll be right back with Robert Greene, author of The 33 Strategies of War. We are back with Robert Greene, author of The 33 Strategies of War. Well, one thing I wanted to talk about was that despite the fact that you've been critical, obviously, of Iraq, you actually appeared to, if I'm understanding you correctly from the book, you thought that we exited too quickly from the first, from the Gulf War. From a strategic point of view, politics aside, just it wasn't good strategy to pull out when we did. We didn't pick the right moment.
Well,
is that right?
You see, I don't want to turn this into a political discussion. This is something where you're trying to look at it from a neutral strategic point of view. And there are two sides to this. The first President Bush was under the belief that if you went and knocked out Saddam, the question is, should he have gone all the way to Baghdad and gotten rid of Saddam Hussein? That's the question. And the first Bush didn't do that because he feared the incredible chaos that would ensue, and he wasn't ready to put some other power in there, and he was worried about the dynamic in the Middle East.
And do you think that was the right strategy?
No, looking back in retrospect, it was not, and for the simple reason of course, it's so much easier to be the Monday morning quarterback, and it was a very difficult decision. But looking back, what happened was when you go part of the way, you defeat an enemy like a Saddam Hussein, but you don't take him out, is you have somebody who's a very powerful person, a very clever person. He's now going to spend the next 10 years of his term doing everything he can to mess with you. And it ended up costing us billions of dollars. Every couple of years he does something and we have to send another aircraft carrier there and send more inspectors. He controlled the dynamic, even though he was the much weaker partner in there. And if we were going to take out Saddam Hussein, that was the moment to do it. There was a relative peace going on with the Israelis. The situation wasn't as volatile. You had people in the north, the Kurds, and some of the Shiites in Basra who were ready to revolt against Saddam Hussein. If that was the time to take him out, it was then.
I want to ask you, we talk a lot about the American strategy on this and how America's doing. And I guess maybe you can infer the opposite from that, but what do you think of the other side? How are they doing from a strategic point of view? Did Hussein have a sound strategy? Do the insurgents, the terrorists, whoever, have a sound strategy? I mean, is it wise to take on America, the remaining superpower, that sort of thing? I mean, what would you say from a strategic point of view on that?
Well, it's a great question. And we'll never know. We'll never know what he was thinking. But I think it's a problem that the United States has traditionally in the military. And I don't mean to be too critical of our military because they do a great job and there's some brilliant people in it. But one weakness we have is we never quite understand the enemy. We don't understand how they're thinking. We sort of impose our own ideas.
You have an example in maybe from World War II or from the British, I think, from earlier war, where they so disregarded their enemy that they didn't take them seriously. So they didn't even think it was worthwhile to try to get inside their mind. Is that maybe part of the problem, that we just think that we're so much better than them, or at least militarily, that we don't even have to worry about?
Or we kind of project our own desires and our own way of thinking on the enemy. We assume that they all want what we want, a democracy in our style, or we assume that Saddam Hussein is going to fight a battle in the traditional way. It has since come out. There's a great book, if you want to read it, called The Assassin's Gate by George Packer, wrote a book on the Iraq War. Really good book. Came out last year. And basically, evidence has been uncovered that Saddam Hussein, from the beginning, was going to fight a guerrilla warfare against the United States. He knew he couldn't win this direct war. And so his whole plan was to melt into the countryside, spread his money around, have cells of different operators throughout the country, and wage a guerrilla war, which he's doing, and is a very successful guerrilla war in many ways. So from that point of view, it is successful. I mean, the question is, how does one fight a superpower like we are? And I don't know, it's hard to look at it from their point of view, but obviously we have our weaknesses, and an example like Vietnam or Iraq shows that even the weakest opponent can take us on.
Yeah, and partly, again, when you talk about the politics off the battlefield or how you can fight the war, you talk about how in, let's say, Vietnam, they use the press against them, and I would argue in the same case you would have that in the current war, that if you get the American public thinking, hey, this war is going nowhere, it's a big mistake, you can win the war through that.
Completely. A country like the United States very much depends on the will of its people. And in the Vietnam War, which I discuss in there, the North Vietnamese had a general who I think was a genius. His name was Giap. And he looked and he studied, he saw World War II, and he decided the United States would not have succeeded in World War II without Roosevelt getting the American public's backing. And he saw that in the Vietnam War that was the weak point of the United States effort. And so he very cleverly played to television and public opinion and weakened our resolve to fight the war.
Well, this is Robert Greene. The book is The 33 Strategies of War. Thank you very much for being here today,
Thank you very much for having me.
Subject.
Yes,
Thanks everybody for watching. We'll see you next time.